Hello and welcome. So, in this video, I thought I'd show you how I painted the Mars-like bases for my Adeptus Mechanicus army. I wouldn't call this method speed painting, but it's relatively quick and well worth the effort in my opinion. Overall, bases deserve more love than they're often getting. The base is already zenithally primed, which is not a requirement by the way, so let's start with the base coat. I had 4 colors here, black, dark red, and 2 oranges basically. As you can see, it's a big base, so I used a big brush. Remember to pick your tools accordingly. I started by applying the mid-tone orange with a stippling motion, mainly targeting the top surfaces. You definitely don't have to be careful at this point. The main objective here is just to cover everything in paint. I move around quickly, and while the first color is still wet, I start applying the lightest orange on places I want to highlight and darker red where I want to introduce some more of the red tones. Already as I'm placing these first spots of color and the paint is still wet, I start blending those colors together on the base by moving and stippling my brush in the area between the colors. This is pretty much all that wet blending is, and base is a great opportunity to try it out, so do it if you haven't already. The transitions between the colors don't need to be totally smooth. In fact, the roughness and texture are actually beneficial in creating visual interest on the base. As I went on, I kept exaggerating the natural shadows and highlights with the dark reds and bright oranges. You often hear people saying it's all about contrast in mini painting, and they're not wrong. And remember, there is always room for artistic impression, so you can just place the colors where they feel right instead of overanalyzing how light would interact with the environment. There is no restriction on how many layers of paint you can have, so feel free to keep at it until you get the look you want. When you're going over areas that have already dried, a good way to blend new color into those areas is called feathering, or void blending in some circles. It's quite simple. Just clean your brush after applying an area of paint. And with that moist brush, you then start sort of pulling the paint outwards from the edges of the area. The water in your brush mixes with the wet paint, and as it becomes gradually thinner over distance, it creates a fade from one color to another. Another good option is also to thin your paints to almost a wash consistency and then stipple that on for subtle color changes. When the base coat was done, I had all the major volumes of the base picked out, and it was already looking pretty decent. When I had the base coat covered, I wanted to emphasize the rough texture on the base, and there's no better tool for that than good old dry brushing. I used a Caucasian skin tone, in this case a scale color golden skin. It's essentially a light orange, so makes sense, right? It provides a strong enough contrast to work great with the washes I'll be applying later, while still keeping with the overall warm tone of the base. Suddenly all the edges and small rocks gain a ton of definition. This alone might be totally enough if you want to be quick, but we can improve it further with some washes. These washes help to bring the dry brushed highlights down a bit and boost the definition further. And while doing so, they also subtly tint the color below, generally adding to the visual interest. I used a lineup of brown, red and orange washes from Citadel. For the most part, I used the lighter colors on the highlighted areas and darker colors on the shadows, but weren't too careful with the placement, as you can probably see. I went from pot to base and back to pot very liberally, once again mixing the paints on the base rather than a palette. One thing I didn't want to happen was for the base to go too far into the yellow spectrum, so I did try to use the Casandor yellow in moderation. As a side note, if you don't have a hairdryer to dry your washes with, at least consider it. It greatly speeds up the process. After the wash had dried, I applied a second, very targeted dry brush highlight of golden skin only to the very sharpest edges to boost the contrast just a bit further. After this step, the actual painting part was over. Now it's just about adding the finishing touches and matte varnish. To bring some of the dusty feeling to the base, I lightly applied some reddish pigments with a brush. And lightly is the keyword here, because if you put on too much, it will soon cover everything and destroy all that contrast you spent so long to build. I actually put on too much to my liking, and that's what you see me fixing here. I saturate the area around my little mistake in water and use the brush to draw most of the pigment off. Problem solved, for the most part at least. I didn't see it necessary to bind the pigments any better at this point, as I would varnish the base anyway. As the last step, I wanted to add a couple little points of interest. In other words, grass tufts. Sure, could have been skulls too. And before you say, "But there's no grass on Mars," check the title of this video. It's Mars-like bases, right? Now, it's pretty likely that there are other red planets in the universe than just Mars, so shut it. Over the years, I've managed to gather a huge collection of different tufts, and here I picked a variety of arid ones that better suit this desert-like environment. Attaching the tufts is trivial. Just screw them on with a dab of superglue. A toothpick is a great tool to actually push the tuft into the glue so that there is no gap between the tuft and the ground. For some added fanciness, I gave the tufts a touch of Reichland flesh shade wash to their bases. A small amount is enough to tie them to the environment better. You can totally paint your tufts too. And that's about it. I painted the base in black and applied AK's ultramatte varnish to even the finish out. The Citadel washes tend to leave a satin finish that I'm not a fan of, especially on bases. But hey, let's see what the finished product looks like. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, press the like button, comment if you have anything to say, feedback, questions, whatever. Subscribe for potentially more videos in the future. I think I'm starting to get the hang of the editing workflow and my script writing is getting faster, so hopefully the next video doesn't take quite as long to produce. Thank you once again. Get those bases painted and may the Emperor be with you.